In the lead up to our African Hospitality Investment Forum, which is due to take place next week in Nairobi on the 12th, 13th and 14th of June, we are organizing our AHIF podcast. Today in our podcast series, I'm delighted to be joined by Thomas Emanuel, Senior Director of STR. Welcome, Thomas.
Thanks, Tanya. Good to be here. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too. Thomas, STR provides data solutions for the global hospitality industry. Do share with us what kind of data do you provide for your clients and how do you typically work with your clients?
Sure, happy to. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be on the podcast as well. So as you rightly said, STR, we provide data solutions. So we are very much the market leaders in hotel performance data. And the core of our business is benchmarking. So we collect data from more than 78,000 hotels around the world on a daily, weekly and monthly basis and provide them with benchmarking analysis to allow them to understand obviously their competitive position in related to the market and also their direct competitor set, those hotels that they compete with every night for a share of wallet effectively. And we deliver this in a range of different key performance indicators. So occupancy, average rate, RevPAR are probably the three that people are most familiar with, but we also collect segmentation data. So we look at group, transient, as well as monthly profitability data. And we also collect business on the books as well. So we've got a full range of historical and forward-looking KPIs. We also have a full supply and pipeline database, which is very relevant, of course, for Africa as we look to the future. But this allows our clients to also understand the existing supply and the future supply. And as well as providing benchmarking, then we also work with a whole plethora of what we sort of, the umbrella term we use internally is industry partners. So they are our partners within the industry. Obviously, they're advisors, investors, developers, analysts, lenders, governments, destination marketing organizations, vendors, anybody really who's got an interest in the hospitality industry. And we provide this data to them to help them, of course, make better business decisions. And I think it's worth mentioning as well, I'm sure you're aware and most people who are listening are also aware that STR was acquired by the CoStar Group back in 2019. And since then, we've been working diligently to integrate our data into CoStar, which is an incredible software platform looking at commercial real estate data. And we took a major step forward in this last month when we launched our new benchmarking product, which is fabulous software allowing hoteliers to log in and interact with live data, providing them with a plethora of new analysis, graphs, tools as well. So this is a really big step for us, and we're delighted with it. The feedback from clients has been great, and we'll be working diligently to launch that new software to all of our hotel participants in the coming months ahead. So in short, it's a really exciting and very busy time for the business.
So talking about an exciting and busy time for the business, we are recording this podcast in the lead up to the African Hospitality Investment Forum. So, talking of data, what have you seen in the African hospitality market in the last 18 months? So, how did you see the market evolve in recent months?
Sure. So actually, when we look at Africa, it has evolved in quite a similar way to other regions across the globe. The general pattern is basically occupancy is not quite back in most markets, but average rates are considerably ahead. And obviously we're referring to pre-COVID here. So occupancy still in those final stages of recovery and rates way ahead. So a very typical pattern. I think much of Africa initially, when we think back to the initial stages of recovery, was a little bit further behind many other regions. And I think two reasons predominantly for that. The first is a relative lack of domestic demand when you compare that to other markets. Obviously, there are exceptions, of course, when you look at bigger economies, and also airlift has obviously taken some time to come back, and African hotels are very, very reliant for the most part on airlift. These are not drive to or train to markets. So it was a little bit slower to come back, but ultimately now pretty much in line with the rest of the world in terms of recovery. But of course, you can't talk about Africa as one, right? I mean, that's something we've talked about over the years at this conference. 54 different nations, very different, economies, cultures, and so on and so forth. So we do see some differences by country, of course. And if we look year to date, we've seen some sub-Saharan African markets have a really stellar time of it, actually. So there are definitely some differences when we compare across the continent.
And what trends have you seen in the market?
So I think generally speaking, if we look at the current year, I think it's really been a year of relative stability. As I mentioned, occupancies for the most part hovering just slightly below and rates significantly ahead. Now, of course, as I said, there are fluctuations, but I think the main thing to say is demand is now solidly back. We're not seeing markets lagging significantly behind where they were in the pre-COVID days. Also, when we look at the time of year, we're in the beginning of June now. We're starting to see things ramp up for the summer months for some of those resorts across the continent. Other trends, there are some currency issues, particularly in Egypt and Ghana, which are proving potentially a little bit more challenging. Obviously, as I mentioned, different countries, different economies. But I think there's some real positive good news stories, which of course we always like to focus on. And I mentioned just a moment ago that some sub-Saharan African cities have had a really good year to date. I mean, Addis, Nairobi, Lagos, all with much stronger occupancy than we saw in 2019. So really good news there. And then the other thing that I've noticed, which I think again is a real positive, is we start to see some events which haven't traditionally been a big driver of demand for Africa as a whole. Of course, you've got, certain cities that have got the facilities that have historically benefited. But when we look at the data, you can see the African Union Summit in Addis, for example, in February, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in June of last year, and then the FIFA Congress, both of those latter two being in Kigali in Rwanda, and those having a really positive impact on performance. So we're starting to see a nice trend relating to events as well, which, as I say, not something that we've typically associated with Africa. So that's a real good news story there.
Sounds great. So my next question was going to be, what your view on the development of Africa's hospitality performance is and what we have in store for the rest of 2023, but it seems that it's a positive outlook.
I do believe so. I think if we look at the top line trading, it does remain strong. So generally speaking, I feel pretty positive about the rest of the year. And of course, traditionally speaking, a lot of the African markets that we cover are corporate markets. So that sort of September, October, November period, usually the strongest months of the year as well. So I think we should see things tick up quite nicely in those predominantly corporate markets. There is, of course, though, and this is something I always do like to talk about when we're looking at Africa, we look at supply and the pipeline. And currently, if we look at the opening dates that we're receiving when we're collecting the pipeline, there are an additional 12,500 rooms to open across the continent this year. Now, realistically, they're not all going to come to fruition in this calendar year, but ultimately that's still a significant amount of new supply. Some of it will obviously be clustered in certain markets. Certainly Egypt has an enormous pipeline in comparison to other countries, but that's something that we'll definitely be keeping an eye on in the coming weeks, months and years ahead, because too much supply coming quickly can obviously have an impact on the performance of a market. Not necessarily saying that's going to happen, but we will be watching closely to see how supply develops over the coming months.
So let's see. I mean, you will be joining us next week in Nairobi, talking about insight on Africa. What are the numbers telling us? So we are very much looking forward to your presentation. But without revealing too much, what will you be focusing during your presentation.
Well, I'm looking forward to it as well. It'd be good to be back in Nairobi for sure. It's been a few years for me, so that will be nice. I will be focusing obviously on the performance across the region. I mean, that goes without saying. We'll have a look at the cities. I'm also going to drill down and have a look at resorts in a little bit more detail. Which I think will be interesting, sort of that more leisure demand, and also obviously commenting on the demand drivers as we see them across those key markets. And then I've already referenced it, but we'll do a deep dive into the all-important pipeline as well and look at developments across the continent. So there'll be plenty to cover during that presentation slot.
Sounds great, because we are going to focus on leisure destination development as well. So that will then lead nicely over to our panelists. There is an exciting program. So if anybody wants to join, there is still a chance. So my final question to you, Thomas, in your opinion, what are the key considerations for anybody looking to enter the African hospitality market?
So I think, summarizing things at a very high level, I think know your market. Have good partners, understand the connectivity, very important, be patient. I think that's important when looking at Africa, and then of course utilize STR's data to make sure you get the best possible analysis and understanding of the market.
Fantastic. Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We certainly look forward to seeing you next week in Nairobi.
Thanks, Tanya.
Thanks,
we'll
Thomas.
see you next week. Thank you.